In a gravel lot on the edge of Tulsa, Oklahoma, 43 people were living out of tents. When the temperature dropped below freezing for the third night in a row, a retired pipefitter named Daryl Okafor had watched it happen from his porch for 2 winters. So he drove to a scrapyard, bought corrugated steel for under $500 a unit, and bent it into small curved shelters. Barely big enough to stand up in, he built the first one for a woman named Ruth, who had been living in that lot since her husband died. She painted the door blue and wrote Ruth's house above it in white letters. The video of that first build reached 6.2 million views. Then the county sent a crew with bolt cutters to remove 12 of the huts in one morning. What happened next is the part nobody in that town expected. According to federal government's own point-in-time count from January 2025, more than 770,000 people across the United States were living in shelters, in transitional housing, or sleeping outside with nothing over their heads at all. Close to 140,000 of them were children. Another 45,000 were veterans. Those numbers had climbed for the third year in a row. Not a sudden spike, just a slow, grinding rise that most people never notice because it happens one family at a time. Texas alone accounted for more than 60,000 of that total. Ohio added another 12,000. In cities from Phoenix to Columbus, the number of people living out of cars and vans has kept climbing since the pandemic, even as rents have leveled off. Over 900,000 public school students nationwide now lack a stable address. That is, children doing homework in a car under a streetlight, in a shelter cafeteria, or on a relative's couch because there is nowhere else to go. Some teachers keep backpacks of clean clothes in their classrooms for kids they know are not sleeping at home. You have probably driven past someone living this way more times than you realize. A tent behind a gas station, a car with the windows fogged up at 6 a.m., a man asleep on a bench you walk past on your way to work. Most of us learn to look past it, not because we don't care, because the problem feels too big for any one person to touch. And while state legislatures have spent years debating housing bonds and multi-year construction timelines, something else has been happening quietly, block by block, with none of the fanfare and none of the funding. Ordinary people, with no government budget and no official title, have been driving to scrapyards, buying sheet steel, and bending it into small curved shelters they give away for free. This is a story of how that habit turned into a movement, how a $500 steel hut welded together in a driveway ended up in a dozen states, and why. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly why a county government once sent bolt cutters after one. And while politicians have been debating multi-year housing plans and billion-dollar bond measures, something different has been happening at the ground level, one weekend at a time. Ordinary Americans, people with no government budget and no fancy title, have been driving to steel yards, buying corrugated sheet metal, and bending it into small arch huts for their neighbors sleeping outside, not for a paycheck, not for a headline, just because someone finally decided the wait had gone on long enough. No architects, no permits, no press release, just a truck, a welder, and someone who got tired of driving past the same person every single day. A single sheet of steel, bent over a simple frame, can become a dry, lockable room in one afternoon. Add a coat of paint, a second-hand door, and a padlock, and you have something a tent could never offer, a room that locks from the inside. The material cost runs as low as $500 a unit. That number will come up again and again in this video, and by the end you will understand why it matters more than any billion-dollar line item in a city budget. This is the story of how that idea spread, from a single build in one gravel lot to dozens of cities across the country, not because anyone planned it that way, because it worked, and word travels fast when something actually works. It is also the story of why some of the very people this idea was meant to help ended up watching get hauled away on a flatbed truck, and why what happened after that mattered even more than the huts themselves. It starts, like most of these stories do, with one person who got tired of watching someone else suffer and decided a scrapyard run was cheaper than waiting for someone else to fix it. He had no way of knowing how far it would spread. The welder in that first video was a man named Tomas Reyes, 34 years old, working out of a rented garage bay on the north side of Flint. Reyes had spent 2 winters himself sleeping in his truck after a layoff at the plant, so he understood what it felt like to have nowhere warm to go. The man under the overpass was Walter Briggs, but the regulars at the corner store just called him Walt. He had been sleeping rough for almost 8 years. Everyone on that block knew him, knew his laugh, knew his stories about the assembly line back in the 70s. Nobody had done a single thing about it. One day Reyes looked at that situation, and something in him just broke. Not sadly, angrily. He later said, "Everybody on this street knows Walt. They wave at him. They buy him coffee. Why does nobody actually give him a door that locks?" So he went to a scrapyard on the edge of town, bought a stack of galvanized steel sheeting for under $500, and bent it by hand into an 8-foot arch hut right there in his driveway. It had a plywood floor, a door with a real lock, and a small vent cut into the curve of the roof to keep the air from turning stale. Reyes filmed the whole build on his phone and posted it online. The video exploded. Within a week, it had crossed 4 million views. His messages filled up overnight with welders, veterans, retirees, and even a group of high schoolers asking how they could help. He set up an online fundraiser called Steel Roofs, no questions asked. It pulled in more than $70,000 in 10 days. Over the following months, Reyes built and gave away 31 more huts across Flint and the surrounding county, adding insulation panels, a small solar light, and a steel-reinforced door on each new version. The cost per unit settled around $900. Each one gave someone something a tent never could: a door that locked from the inside, a little bit of their name back. As for Walt, he still keeps the first hut Reyes built him, the one with the crooked seam along the roof where Reyes was still learning how the metal bent. He says he likes it that way. Proof, he says, that someone learned how to help him as they went. But the city of Flint did not celebrate Tomas Reyes. Instead, code enforcement officers showed up on a Tuesday morning and tagged 4 of his huts for removal, citing them as unpermitted structures on public right-of-way. By the end of the week, 2 had already been hauled off on a flatbed and crushed at the scrapyard where Reyes had bought the steel in the first place. A spokesperson for the mayor's office called the huts a liability risk, said the residents living inside them would be better served by the county's emergency shelter system. Keep in mind, this was the same county that had spent 4 years and $40 million trying to renovate a single shelter building that still was not open. The same county where more than 300 people were sleeping outside on any given night, whether the shelter existed or not, waiting on a project that kept slipping its own deadlines. And their answer to a welder spending his own savings to give 8 people a locked door was to send a truck to take it away. The backlash was immediate. Local news picked up the story. A crowd gathered outside City Hall with signs made from the same corrugated steel Reyes used for the huts, some of them borrowed straight off unfinished builds sitting in his driveway. Within 10 days, the city quietly returned what was left of the seized structures and agreed to a temporary variance while a permanent policy was worked out. Reyes kept building anyway. By the following spring, he had put together nearly 90 huts across 3 counties, refining the design every few weeks based on what people told him they needed most. He was not the only one. A man named Curtis Boone, who had spent 6 years homeless himself before finding steady work at a body shop, started welding his own version and selling them to other unhoused people for just $200 apiece. He told a local reporter that a stranger once handed him cash on the spot before the paint had even dried. He has sold 9 so far, because he understands something the billion-dollar programs keep missing, and it is the same thing you are about to see prove itself in a much bigger way a few hundred miles east. People sleeping outside tonight do not want to wait 3 years for a committee to approve a design. They need a roof now. While all of this was happening in Michigan, a completely different approach to the same idea was taking shape nearly 600 miles south, in Springfield, Missouri. And this one focused specifically on the men and women who had served their country. In 2017, a group of combat veterans led by Marcus Whitfield and Dana Okonkwo founded an organization called Steel Haven. These were people who had done tours overseas, come home, and watched their fellow veterans slide into homelessness, with almost nobody noticing until it was too late. Nationally, only about 1/3 of homeless veterans placed in transitional housing ever made it into something permanent. The rest cycled back onto the street within a year. Whitfield and Okonkwo were done watching that number stay the same. Their plan was simple: build a small village of steel huts, surround it with the kind of support that actually helps someone rebuild a life, not just survive another winter. Today, their campus sits on 4 acres just outside downtown Springfield. It holds 36 huts, each about 160 square feet, wired for electricity, connected to shared water and sewer lines, and stocked with a cot, a heater, and a locking footlocker for whatever someone still owns. Across the gravel lot sits a converted warehouse where veterans can meet with case managers, apply for benefits, see a dentist for free twice a month, and pick up clothes from a donated closet. That building has served more than 3,000 veterans since it opened. One of them was a former Army mechanic named Dale Petrov. After his second deployment, his marriage ended, and he spent almost 4 years sleeping in his car outside the VA hospital parking lot. Too proud to walk in and ask for a bed, he later said he finally won the day he realized he no longer recognized his own reflection. Steel Haven gave him one of the huts, a case manager, something he had not had in years, a locked door with his name on the file behind it. 6 months later, he was managing the very warehouse that had once handed him his first hot meal. One detail that came straight from talking to veterans on the street was a no-questions-asked pet policy, since so many had chosen to stay outside rather than give up a dog. Nationally, veteran homelessness has dropped nearly 40% since 2015. Organizations built on this exact model are a real part of why, and one of them, 1,000 miles from here, would go on to prove the model works at a scale nobody expected. Starting in 2018, a nonprofit called Ground Level began building steel hut villages across Columbus, Ohio, as a direct replacement for the tent camps spreading along the river. Each hut runs about $650 in materials, wired for a single outlet and a space heater, insulated with foam board donated by a local supplier, with a shared bathhouse and laundry trailer serving every cluster of 20 units. What sets Columbus apart is the sheer scale of ordinary people showing up to help. Hundreds of students, church groups, and local businesses have built and donated more than 210 huts. There are now 9 villages scattered across the city, tucked behind a church, beside a warehouse nobody was using anyway, each one small enough to fit on a single vacant lot. At one build day held in a college parking lot, 300 volunteers welded and painted 18 huts before sundown. A high school robotics club built one from a kit they engineered themselves and left a handwritten welcome note taped inside the door for whoever moved in. A retired steel worker who showed up to help said it was the first time in 40 years on an assembly line that he had watched something he built go straight to a person who needed it. And the numbers tell the real story. Since 2021, more than 4,000 people across Franklin County have transitioned off the street through these villages. Over 96% of those who moved into permanent housing were still housed a year later. Compare that to what happened with the city's own rapid rehousing initiative. The city spent $210 million on that program. And according to its own year-end report, nearly 45% of the people placed into housing were back on the street within 12 months. $210 million. Almost half the people ended up right back where they started. That contrast tells you everything. A volunteer-built steel hut costing a few $100s in materials, and a government program that spent hundreds of millions chasing the exact same outcome. One of them is still standing behind that church on a Tuesday morning with a light on inside. The other one is a line item in a report nobody outside City Hall has read. The movement has now spread to cities you might not expect. In Reno, Nevada, a machinist spent under $500 on galvanized sheeting and built a hut for a woman who had slept behind a laundromat for 11 winters. She painted the door blue, named it the last stop, and told a reporter it was the first door she had locked from the inside in over a decade. Not glamorous, she said, but a locked door beats a wet sleeping bag every single time. It took him a weekend to build. It took the city 3 months to decide not to fight him on it. In Louisville, Kentucky, a nonprofit called Second Roof launched a rent-to-own program for people aging out of foster care or coming off disability leave. Residents pay a modest monthly rent, and anyone who stays 5 years owns the hut outright. No bank, no mortgage, just 5 years of showing up and keeping the lights on. Last December, a woman named Priscilla Vaughn signed a deed to hers and became the program's second homeowner. She keeps the paperwork in a frame on the wall, next to the door, Communities from Albuquerque to rural Vermont are launching their own versions. In Albuquerque, an organization called Rio Grande Roofs broke ground this spring on a planned cluster of 40 huts, with a local credit union pledging to match donations up to $200,000. In Vermont, a faith coalition called Green Mountain Shelters builds 120-square-foot huts using entirely volunteer labor, where residents tend to share a garden and pay just $150 a month in rent. One resident there says the garden matters almost as much as the roof. Even in towns that have never seen a steel hut before, zoning boards are quietly rewriting decades-old ordinances to make room for them, one contentious meeting at a time, usually after someone stands up and asks why a parking garage gets approved in 6 weeks and a roof for a freezing man does not. But not every town has said yes, and the ones that haven't are where the story goes next. Zoning laws in most American cities still make it nearly impossible to place a steel hut legally on a piece of land. Building codes written decades ago never imagined a 100-square-foot house on skids as a real residence. In some towns, a crew can weld a hut together in a single weekend. The permit to actually place it can take 18 months. Cities that should be thanking people for solving a problem on their own dime are instead sending code officers to write citations for the same problem nobody else fixed. Even so, a few state governments have started paying attention. Ohio recently announced it would fund materials for 300 additional huts, distributing kits through the same volunteer networks that have been building them for free all along. A government finally borrowing a page from the people who never waited for permission in the first place. So how are Americans really building $500 homes for people the system keeps losing track of? One sheet of steel at a time, with their own hands, using their own money or a stranger's donation, not waiting for a 10-year plan to reach year 3, just building. Tomas Reyes never had a grand strategy. He just saw a man sleeping under a bridge and decided he was done driving past him. That same impulse has now spread from a garage in Flint to a gravel lot in Tulsa, to a church basement in Vermont, one welded seam at a time. Walt still keeps that first crooked hut, the one with the seam Reyes was still learning how to bend. He says it proves someone learned how to help him as they went. If this video opened your eyes, hit subscribe. I cover stories like this every week, the kind that show you what is actually happening in this country when nobody is filming.